I want to talk a little bit about what's happening on the industry side, simply because a lot of what we hear lately doesn't really have to do as much with what's happening internally at companies. And so, and the reason for that is simple. It's just very difficult, and these are complex topics to talk about. So I'm going to try to give a little bit of a sense of what we're seeing. But first, I want to start with a little bit of wisdom from Mr. Weasley from Harry Potter. This comes from Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And at the very end of the book, and I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody, it was published in 1998, so I feel a little bit safe. Ginny, his daughter, has been bewitched by the diary of Tom Riddle. And they finally figure out what's been happening. And Mr. Weasley says, "Haven't I taught you anything? What have I always told you? Never to trust anything that can think for itself if you can't see where it keeps its brain." Now, I think this is really relevant for artificial intelligence because one of the challenges that we have around understanding these technologies is that those of us who are lay people who are not data scientists or machine learning engineers don't know where it keeps its brain and don't know how its brain works. So just in the interest of clarity, a couple of very, very simple definitions just to kind of put us all on the same page. When I talk about artificial intelligence today, I am not going to get into an argument about which kinds of machine learning count and which ones don't count. I want to talk actually just simply about two things. One is technologies that are autonomous, meaning that they can act on their own and make decisions and transactions on their own. And then the second is that they're self-learning, that they're able to learn from past data and experience. The second is ethics, because this is, of course, something we've been talking about a lot in the last year, and yet with very little clarity. So I just want to simply say that ethics is, in its simplest form, a set of moral principles that govern our behavior. And when you take the fact that with AI, we don't really know where it keeps its brain all the time. We'll talk about that a little bit more specifically. And that it can make decisions and act, and that it can learn, and that we don't necessarily have a set of norms to guide us the same way that we do in the physical world, it opens us up to some issues. So, pro forma, a little bit of industry momentum here. What's fascinating about this statistic from Gartner is that the year before, I think they said and this comes from the Gartner CIO survey, I think the year before they said 4% of CIOs were actively deploying artificial intelligence in some form in their enterprises. This year it was much, much higher. I think it almost quadruples, or at least tripled. What's interesting here is I think, and Gartner was caveating this quite a bit, there may have been some skunkworks projects they weren't completely aware of. But be that as it may, there's tons more activity happening. And of course, as a result, tons more implications that we're starting to see. Now, what's driving the momentum is really important to think about when we talk about sort of a set of norms for artificial intelligence. And I want to explain why, because when we get into these conversations about what ethics is and what artificial intelligence ethics is more specifically, we tend to focus on the types of use cases that we're closest to. So at the very beginning of kind of the maturity, I suppose the maturity roadmap, if you'd like to call it that, companies tend to start with optimization. They tend to start with things like, how can we take cost out of the system? How can we do robotic process automation? How can we just simply optimize our business? Well, taking cost out of the system typically means taking people out of the system, and that's where a lot of that job conversation comes from. I'm not going to talk about that today. That's not my area of expertise. But once we get into that next phase, and once companies have done this, and they start to kind of open their eyes to some other ways to use this technology, they start looking at things like natural language processing and computer vision to help them with decision making. That could be decision making in the criminal justice system, in education. It could be decision making about marketing and audience segmentation, or recommendation engines in commerce, all sorts of different kinds of things, or churn, in a business. And once you start looking at improved decision-making, then you start to come across some of the issues that we're seeing around explainability and around bias and some other things that I'm going to talk about. Once they've gotten that far, The next question is, well, we've kind of improved our decision making, or we're starting to see what the potential is. How can we improve our business? Are there new products? Are there new services? Are there new business models or revenue models that we can look at? Can we disrupt our own organization or our own industry or competitors? And that's where kind of their eyes start to get a little bit bigger. So once we move through this process, we start seeing some different issues emerge. Now, I want to just be very clear, especially since I come from the heart of the Silicon Valley, which is also the heart of hype. I'm there. I got to tell you, I have the scars to prove it. So I want to acknowledge that yes, there's a ton of hype around artificial intelligence, but it is also legitimately transformative. Maybe not this second, at this moment in time, but as a potential way for organizations to complete digital transformation, if you want to call it that, or to be able to behave in an agile manner at scale. You have to be able to learn in an agile manner at scale, and that's what AI partly enables. And so it's important to understand sort of what the trends are that are shaping the industry. Now, to be clear, these little trends that I'm going to show you, or these big trends, come from qualitative research with enterprise leaders, academics, NGOs, you name it, folks who are either themselves machine learning engineers, data scientists, in HR, in leadership, in operations, et cetera, and in strategy. So the first thing that we're seeing are changes in how we interact with technology. We're moving from a world, when I was a younger person, where, if you want to interact with technology, you sit down at a computer, usually a pretty heavy one, and you type stuff into the computer, to a place now where I can speak to my watch, you can speak to your phones, you can speak to your cars, the robot outside can identify you. The little weird cylinder on your dining room table can play your music. And we're starting to interact much more in a sensory way. And that also goes, for things like haptics, the way that we touch and pinch and zoom, which was unthinkable 20 years ago, or at least except for in the movies. So that's the first piece. And by the way, researchers are working on taste and smell, but that's a little too far for me, just so you know. If you've ever walked through a mall, there's enough fragrance going on. The next thing is how we make decisions, and I mean that in a kind of personal way, but also in a kind of commercial way or more collective way, which is that from a programming standpoint, we're moving from a world of if-then statements that then govern the next action to probabilities. And so I'll give you an example. Stripe, which is a payments company, has a capability when they're signing people up and they're looking at transactions to see that, for example, if a company organizes itself sets up shop in, one city, let's say Ottawa, and it's a, car body shop or something like that, and most of its transactions are coming from thousands of miles away, there might be some fraud or some money laundering going on. Now, that's different from me traveling to Ottawa, forgetting to file my travel plan, and automatically having my credit card declined because I'm not in the right place. That is set by if-then statements. All of the banks are now looking at ways to better understand my travel patterns and understand me more as a person, and therefore be able to keep my credit card working. The next thing is around leadership. I actually participated in some research with Microsoft about the impact of AI on leadership. And, it's no surprise to us that we're moving from kind of a hierarchy and expertise-led world into one in which data is infusing, if not making the decisions, right? I don't think we'll all go that far, but at least informing our decisions. And this is kind of the old standby from Harvard Business Review about the HIPPO organization, the HIPPO being the highest paid person's opinion. That's how we mostly make decisions. And that's a big organizational change management issue for people to now kind of figure out. I led as an expert in my field. Now, how do I lead? So that's a big difference. The next is around how we innovate. Data used to be exhaust. Now it's fundamental to many products and services. And this is not the best analogy, I know, but obviously with a lot of implications. And then finally, how we behave. because we don't have established ways to behave in digital spaces. We've evolved some. I would argue, if you spent any time on Twitter lately, not necessarily in the most productive way. So, here's how we think about the impact of AI from an ethical point of view. In the Valley, this is fascinating to me, by the way. This is from about 2 years ago when Alex Stamos was the chief security officer at Facebook. And this is when the whole kind of stuff came out about the 2016 election in the US. And he kind of went on a Twitter rampage one day and finally said, nobody at the big companies is not aware of the impact of, is not aware that algorithms aren't neutral. Nobody's not aware of the risks. So if you excuse him for all the double negatives, essentially what he's saying is that, you know, the big company, like at the big companies, those of us who are sitting in the expensive seats, like we all know about this. So why are we acting like this is new news? Well, it's new news to the rest of the world, by the way, right? Because we all think of math as neutral. Here's how the rest of the world thinks about it. This is a real Google search I did. Could artificial intelligence create an unemployment crisis, make doctors obsolete, replace our teachers, take over the world, be dangerous, have consequences, ever replace humans, be humanity's biggest threat, and my favorite, get depressed? I don't know. I see a gap here. I think you probably do too. So I want to talk about 4 specific issues. And these issues, I'm not going to talk about, as I said before, I'm not going to talk about automation. I'm not even going to talk about the trolley problem. I want to talk about 4 specific things that are implications of AI. The first is around algorithmic bias, or bias in data. And I'll give some examples. The second is around our notions of what authenticity is. So when we all came in this morning, we saw the robot. Nobody in this room mistook that robot for a human being at all, right? I hope. Just, if so, see me after. But you could have been contacting your cable provider or your cell phone provider, and you could have been in an interaction with somebody and not known whether you were talking to a person or a robot, or whether there were handoffs in that interaction. Should you know? That's a big question. The next is around explanation, which the engineers and data scientists in the room will call interpretability, probably. And that is our ability to understand how algorithms came to their conclusions. We have this thing called audit. It's kind of important to know how decisions were made at points in time. And so, because of the nature of convolutional neural networks, it is a challenge that we have to figure out ways to solve. Maybe not over-rotate and solve, right? We don't need to know. I'm not going to sue, Uniqlo if I'm searching for a sweater and they send me a blue one instead of a red one. But, for other kinds of things, it's important. And then finally, ethical use, which is just a simple way of saying governance. So we need to have norms. We need to understand how to use this stuff. I think of bias. And this is, don't go too crazy with this analogy, but bias is kind of like a toxin, in the sense that if you put a few drops of a toxin into that beautiful reservoir, you don't necessarily know where it's going to end up, in which streams, in which tributaries, in which percentages. You don't even know if it's going to affect people, if it's going to affect older folks or kids or people with from a certain background. In society, and these are a lot of the conversations we've been having, we see that there's impact in the criminal justice system of bias and face recognition. We see that there's impact in the healthcare system around where we have good data versus where we have less good data, in education and government. And then there's also an impact to dignity and self-worth of all of us. Now, on the industry side, all this stuff flows through to recommendation engines, translation algorithms, audience segmentation, personalization, ad targeting, you name it. And so anywhere we're using language data and using natural language processing and natural language understanding, there's the potential for bias. Anywhere we're using image data, there's the potential for bias. And by the way, we didn't just invent bias, and I'm not talking about, by the way, statistical bias. I'm talking about unwanted bias we don't want. Anywhere that you have decisions being made using data, you have a potential, right? And we need to be thinking about that thoughtfully. So on the language side, on the left side, what you're seeing is a piece from a paper that was published a few years ago. This is about a data set that's called Word2Vec. It's a data set made up of 30 million words from Google News Stories. So all of these words. And it's used to train natural language algorithms. So things like translation engines and so on. And so what these researchers did, they came from Boston University and Microsoft, is they looked at the kind of adjacencies of certain words to try to understand what their context was according to the algorithm. And what they found, or according to Word2Vec, and what they found was the most male-identified words were professions like maestro and captain and protege and all these really cool male professions, right? And on the women's side, we have homemaker, nurse, receptionist, librarian, homemaker, etc. Now, I'm not going to get all sort of judgmental about this, except simply to say it reveals to us some of the ways in which even language that we would think of as neutral-ish, because they're news stories, these are not like edge blogs that they were using, can contain multitudes. On the voice side, one of the stories from a couple of years ago, and this is getting better, but it's still not ideal, is that if you don't train natural language understanding technology to understand a range of ways of speaking, and you only train them on voices that sound pretty much like mine, or actually maybe not mine, a man's voice, right? Because originally these are trained to understand men's voices, and I'm lucky because I have a low voice as a woman, so they understand me pretty well. My friends with higher voices, not so much. My friends with accents, not so much. My friends who speak dialects, regional dialects, not so much. And so when you think about this, what you end up with is a way in which people are being disenfranchised from an experience in their own home. You also see this in image data. To cut to the chase, this fourth person is a man in a kitchen cooking. Apparently, the algorithm found that to be unbelievable. The name of this paper, by the way, is Men Also Like Shopping. On the left, we have John Lewis being misidentified as a criminal in a criminal suspect database, along with 6 members of the Congressional Black Caucus, by face recognition software. On the right, we have a study by Joy Buolamwini from MIT. One of the things about face recognition, which, by the way, San Francisco has just banned for criminal purposes, for criminal investigations, is that if you're, and this actually, I should have put a different graph up here. If you're a man with light skin, Microsoft has about 100% accuracy in terms of identifying you. If you're a man with darker skin, it goes down a bit. If you're a woman with light skin, it goes down a bit. If you're a woman with darker skin, it's about an 8%. Microsoft has now fixed this, but the average among the companies that she looked at, I think, was somewhere in the 8% range. So for a city like Ottawa, that's 80,000 people, 80,000 women of color who are being misidentified. So that's what to think about. That's one of the issues. Here we have emotion detection, which is another tricky one. In this photograph, which is taken from IMDb, you can see Albert Einstein and a bunch of other people who I should be able to identify, but frankly, who has time? And one woman. All the men are identified as neutral. The woman who also has, in my opinion, a neutral expression is labeled as angry. This isn't good, right? Next, we have deep fakes. So this is from the Dali Museum in St. Petersburg. This is an interactive exhibit. And it is what I would consider to be a legitimate use for synthetic data, what some people will call deep fakes, which is using both either or both image and voice and language data to actually construct a person. To manipulate, you could say manipulate, or you could say to create or generate, depending on the point of view. And so this technology is becoming more and more common and more available. This whatever you want to call it, this presentation was constructed by Goodby Silverstein and Partners, an ad agency. So this gets us into notions of transparency and authenticity, and what do we mean or what do we expect when we interact with technology. So I'm going to give you 3 very quick examples. On the left, you have chatbot situation. This was from Reddit, which, by the way, aside from all the darker ways in which people tend to use Reddit, people also use it for support if they suffer from or if they experience depression or suicidal ideation, meaning that they are in crisis and in danger of self-harm. And so there was a company that was testing its chatbot and decided to introduce it into the suicide watch and depression communities in Reddit, but they kind of forgot to disclose that it wasn't a human being, so it started chatting with people, and then all of a sudden people discovered that they had been talking to a robot about their depression. There are legitimate uses for chatbots in this situation, by the way. It's just all I'm arguing for is you kind of want to disclose that because you need to be trustworthy. The second, this is Sundar Pichai from Google I/O last year. We introduced Duplex, which is a way of creating very natural sounding voice. Originally in that demo, which I would show if we had enough time, you could hear what sounded like a woman calling to make an appointment at a hair salon. It wasn't a woman, it was a voice agent. And now Google is actually disclosing within the product that you're dealing with a voice agent. You're not dealing actually with a human being. And then the third is, this was a fun one also, no time to show it, but this was one that Jordan Peele did with ProPublica, the movie director Jordan Peele, where he essentially had a deep fake of Barack Obama give a public service announcement about deepfake technology. This is an intentionally hideous slide, by the way. This comes from DARPA. DARPA, the Defense, oh God, I can't do the whole acronym. But they are deeply concerned with explainability. They're obviously for many, many reasons, but this also flows into industry, flows into civic life, that we need to understand why algorithms made the decisions that they did, why they didn't do something else, what success looks like, all of these important questions, what failure looks like, and then what happens when the decision is trustworthy, what is that threshold, and then how to correct an error. This is obviously highly important in not any kind of robotic technology that's used by military, but it's also important in our daily lives as we interact with technology. And then there are questions about ethical use, right? And so, if you think back to the DALL-E exhibit, you think, well, that's people are going to a museum, that's lovely. On the other hand, you could use that to manipulate an election. You could use that, and you actually don't even need it, to be honest. So, I don't want to get political here, but just to say, that video of Jim Acosta pushing a young woman's arm away at a press conference at the White House. It was simply a function, I don't know that people meant it intentionally, of turning a video into a GIF. And to do that, you remove a lot of frames. And so it makes something that started was more like this, look like this, right? Because it makes it look more intense. The same with slowing down the Nancy Pelosi video to make her look drunk. So you don't need AI for this, but AI is really good for this. So should you be able to understand if somebody is gay or straight from a photograph? Should you be able to look at emotions and understand what they are? And so, as I mentioned, San Francisco has banned this, both because of the accuracy issues and then, of course, because of the potential for harm. So the important thing to know here, too, is that good intentions are not enough. I would just stipulate that everybody in this room has good intentions, and that most people you will run into in your life have good intentions, and they're building things because they think they're neat and interesting, that they have value, not necessarily thinking of the consequences. So thinking of the consequences and being able to start to run those scenario plans becomes very important. So on the industry side, here's what's happening, and you're not hearing so much about it, but hopefully little by little every day. That there are kind of 4 different areas where I'm seeing organizations really focus, and these are companies like Intel and Microsoft and Salesforce. Now, they're in my backyard, so that's why I kind of know them, but there are more companies who are looking at these kinds of technologies and trying to figure out how to scale an organization-wide ethics or responsible technology initiative. And there are, of course, startups who are working in this area as well. So the first is around research and data science. So one example from each. On the research side, if you're publishing a research paper, to disclose any potential human impact of that technology or of that research that you have identified. So could this be used to create harm, to cause harm to other people in some way, and what are the situations in which it might do so? The next is around product and service development. So, for example, Salesforce is actively incorporating ethics checks into their agile development methodology. So there are 2 points in agile development methodology where engineers, there are many points, but there are 2 particular points where engineers will get together and kind of go through checklists. One is around the definition of ready. When are we ready to start a project? Do we have everything we need? And then the second is the definition of done. When do we know we're complete? And so they're incorporating ethics checks into those, asking questions about, do we understand the provenance of our data? Do we understand how we've constructed the data model? Are there places in which we could, for example, by using zip code, be actually using that as a proxy for race unintentionally? How do we do that? So those are the kinds of things that you would think about. And then around governance, there are things like companies starting to incorporate ethical practices into their declarations of conformity, their supplier declarations, or their master service agreements, to make sure that their customers are using the technology as intended. Some companies do not allow face recognition with their AI platforms. Some do. Under certain circumstances, they tend to be scenario-based, as an example. This is also where you start to see things like AI, not AI audit, but auditable AI. So the idea of processes that can audit an algorithm to identify potential bias. And there are companies working on that, as well as companies working on things like a system of record to understand where decisions were made and under what circumstances. And then finally, there are things around how do we protect potential whistleblowers, and how do we incentivize people to identify issues without kind of bringing down the house. So, we're also seeing this in university settings. There are plenty of organizations now in universities, academic institutions who are starting to incorporate ethics education, and not just ethics, but philosophy, anthropology, sociology, starting to understand a little bit more about how can we bring the humanities in. Google did this a little bit, not necessarily as well as they could have. Airbnb has a process by which the platform will actually ask you if you try to make a booking and the host declines you for some reason that maybe is not so good. It will ask the host, did you mean to block that week? And if the host says no, then it will ask why. And if a host does this multiple times, they'll kick them off. Now, most of the time, if somebody requests a booking and the host comes back and says no, it's because the host is like going somewhere and they forgot, kind of a thing. But sometimes it's for other reasons. So finally, I'm just going to end with this very quick story. A few years ago, Volvo was testing their driverless car in Australia, in Canberra. And the very first, and this is just a test, all right, but the very first thing that car did was it started crashing into kangaroos. And when you think about Volvo, like, you don't think about crashes, right? You think about engineering and real quality control. And, and I believe that, and this was an important learning for them. But the small animal detection system that they were using did not recognize animals that moved like this. It only recognized animals that moved like this. So they fixed it, and they're probably using LiDAR now, which wouldn't have this issue. But the point of this story is every organization has some kangaroo in it that a 2-year-old would probably figure out if that person were diverse, right? So the woman, the person of color, the disabled person, the Australian, working in the Swedish company. So this is where diversity becomes really important. If it can happen with kangaroos, it can happen anywhere. 4 final provocations. We think there are a lot of algorithms in our lives now. Just you wait. That's number 1. Number two, regulations are critically important, but they cannot cover everything and they do not move. That is part of their charm, right? Regulations don't change. They don't change fast enough. They can't accommodate the scale and speed of technology. The more human AI becomes, the more humane we need to make it. And then finally, ethics and innovation are not a zero-sum game. That's my belief. There's plenty of evidence for it out there in the world. So with that, I want to thank you so much for your attention. And I'll be around. Thank you.